They rose from the ice and smoke of the north, not as kings, but as a force no empire saw coming. Carved laws that shaped nations and left their mark in blood and stone.
This cannot be right.
The Norse didn't just raid. They redefined Europe. This is the true legacy of the Vikings. Long before the world feared the name Viking, the people of the North were struggling just to survive. Their home, Scandinavia, offered no mercy. In Norway, deep fjords carved through mountains like wounds from ancient giants. Sweden was cloaked in endless forest. Denmark was flatter, but its winds cut like blades. For months, snow covered the earth. Summers came late and left early. The soil was stingy. The cold was constant. And life was war against the land itself. But the Norse adapted. They grew barley and oats on thin fields. They raised sheep, goats, and cattle, knowing every winter might wipe them out. Every task required patience, strength, and unity. Families worked together to stack hay, fish rivers, and build shelter before the frost returned. There were no second chances. The weak did not last. This land forged its people hard as iron. The cold didn't just shape their bodies, it shaped their minds. Fear became focus, pain became skill, and silence became strength. Isolation wasn't a punishment, it was the condition of life. Most Norse lived miles from the next village. Travel by foot was slow, but the sea, though dangerous, promised a faster way. They watched the waves, they learned the winds. They built boats not for luxury, but for escape. These early communities settled along rivers, coasts, and lakes. They carved timber homes with narrow doorways and grass roofs. Fire pits warmed the inside. Cold seeped through the walls. There were no castles, no temples, just people bound to land and blood. They lived close, fought close, and buried their dead nearby. So memory never wandered far. Outside, powers ignored them. Rome never conquered them. Europe barely knew them. But while the empires of the world obsessed over borders, wealth, and glory, something else was happening in the north. A quiet sharpening, a slow rise. The world wasn't watching, but the Norse were learning. And they were waiting. In this world of snow and stone, order had to be earned. There were no kings yet, just layers of status. At the top stood the Jarls. They were not royal, but they ruled. These were wealthy landowners, military leaders, and political anchors. A Jarl was respected not because of birthright, but because of results. He had to protect his people, lead in battle, and settle disputes with judgment that kept the peace. Below the Jarls were the Carls, the backbone of Norse society. They were farmers, blacksmiths, hunters, and merchants. They lived hard but free. A Carl could own land, carry weapons, speak at the Thing, their local assembly, and be called to war. His voice mattered. If he had proven himself, in the Norse world, your worth was not in your words, but in your deeds. Then came the thralls, slaves, captured in raids or born into bondage. They had no rights under Norse law. Thralls worked the fields, chopped wood, cooked meals, and served households. But Norse society was not entirely closed. A thrall could buy freedom or be granted it. Over time, a former thrall could become a landowner. This wasn't common, but it was possible. And in a world ruled by strength, even slaves were watched for loyalty and talent. What bound this pyramid together wasn't gold or religion, it was honor. Reputation was everything. To lose it was to become invisible. A man could survive without food longer than he could survive without respect. And once lost, no price could buy it back. Children learned this early. Boys were taught to fish, fight, and harvest. Girls learned to manage homes, livestock, and trade. Every child had one job: do not disgrace the family name. And if someone did, blood would follow. In Norse society, law and violence lived side by side. While men built homes and went to sea, women ruled what was left behind. Norse women were not passive. They managed the farms, controlled household finances, and made critical decisions. If a man didn't return from war or trade, his wife held the household together. If a man was dishonored, his sister could defend the family's name in court, or through vengeance. Women could own land, inherit wealth, and divorce abusive husbands. If mistreated, a wife could return to her family, reclaim her dowry, and take her children. These rights weren't gifts. They were expectations. Norse women carried pride like armor. Marriage was not just love. It was alliance. Families arranged matches to strengthen ties and build power. Weddings sealed not just hearts, but land and loyalty. Betrayal in marriage was betrayal to the clan. That's why affairs could spark war, and insults could cost lives. Children were not spared. They were raised to listen, obey, and act. Girls learned negotiation, healing, and home defense. Boys trained with axes before they learned to write their names, if they ever learned at all. Childhood ended early. Responsibility came fast. In a world where a single mistake could lead to death, even the young had to be strong. Family wasn't just emotional. It was survival. If your brother was attacked, you didn't look away. You took up your sword. If your sister was wronged, you didn't beg for justice. You demanded it. Honor ran through the blood, and so did vengeance. For all their reputation as wild raiders, the Norse had law, and they respected it. The most sacred institution was the Thing. This was not a courtroom or a council. It was a gathering of free men where laws were spoken aloud, disputes settled, and punishments delivered. Every region had its own Thing, held at regular intervals. People brought livestock, food, weapons, and grievances. If a man stole, lied, or broke an oath, his case would be heard. Witnesses were called, oaths were taken, the people listened, and the ruling was final. Punishments weren't always brutal. Some men paid fines, others were exiled. But when blood had been spilled, payment was not always enough. That's when Vergild came in, a man price. Kill a jarl and the price was high. Kill a thrall, and it was low. But failure to pay meant one thing: the feud would begin. Feuds could last years. Families fought families. Villages divided. And it was all considered legal, as long as the rules were followed. You had to declare your intent. You had to strike openly. Killing in secret brought shame, not honor. Justice was brutal, but it was structured. And in a world where chaos was close, that structure kept the Norse from falling apart. The sea was never a wall. It was a path. Before the first raids, before the word Viking meant anything, Norsemen were traders. They sailed the Baltic Sea, stopping in what is now Russia, Germany, and Poland. They bartered furs, walrus ivory, honey, and slaves for silver, silk, and glass. They built clinker-built ships, narrow, flexible, fast. These weren't warships yet, but they were fast enough to escape storms and silent enough to move unseen. With every trip, their skills grew, and so did their courage. Trading taught them who was weak and who was rich. They saw gold in Irish monasteries. They saw the unguarded coastlines of Britain. They watched. They remembered. They waited. At home, shipbuilding became an art. Some villages made nothing else. Sailors learned to read stars and seabirds. Children watched fathers lash hulls together with rope and tar. Boats were not tools. They were lifelines. Trade connected the Norse to the world, and soon the world would wish it hadn't. The Norse did not worship in churches. They gathered in sacred groves, carved wooden idols, and whispered to the winds. Their gods were not distant kings. They were warriors, wanderers, and judges. Odin, who gave his eye for wisdom. Thor, who smashed enemies with thunder. Freya, who wept golden tears for love and loss. But Norse belief went deeper than gods. It was rooted in fate. The Norns, 3 mysterious women, wove the threads of life. When your time came, no blade, no prayer, no escape could stop it. All you could do was meet death on your feet. That is what made them so terrifying. They did not fear death. They expected it. They welcomed it if it came with honor. To die in battle meant rising to Valhalla. There they would fight again, feast again, live again. Even burial was sacred. Chiefs were buried with ships, weapons, and animals. Sometimes even people. A death was not an end. It was a passage. A warrior didn't cry. He smiled at fate. This belief didn't make them gentle. It made them fearless. It made them bold. And in time, it made them unstoppable. In the late 700s, the world changed. Norse populations had grown, land was scarce. Inheritance laws left many sons with nothing. Trade was no longer enough. And along the coast of Britain lay monasteries, rich, quiet, undefended. The Norse had seen them, and in the summer of 793, they chose one, Lindisfarne. 3 ships came from the sea. The monks heard the tide. Then they heard the screams. The raiders moved quickly, slaughtering some, capturing others, taking everything. They vanished before the kingdom could respond. The news shocked Christian Europe. This wasn't war. It wasn't rebellion. It was something new. The attackers weren't soldiers. They weren't armies. They were something else. They were Vikings, and Europe would never be the same again. 793 CE, raid on Lindisfarne. What really happened? It started on a small island just off the northeastern coast of England. The monastery at Lindisfarne was a quiet place where monks lived in peace, studied scripture, and prayed. They weren't soldiers. They didn't carry weapons. Their only treasures were books, gold crosses, and sacred objects donated by nobles. But in the early morning of June 8, 793 CE, 3 unfamiliar ships appeared on the horizon, and everything changed. The ships landed without warning. Dozens of armed men rushed ashore. They moved with speed and purpose, knowing exactly what they came for. The wooden doors of the church were broken down. The monks inside were caught off guard, many still in prayer robes. Some tried to hide, others begged for mercy. But the attackers didn't stop. They looted everything of value, gold, silver, relics, and set parts of the monastery ablaze. This wasn't a random act. The raiders knew Lindisfarne held wealth, and more importantly, it held no real defense. The location was remote. The buildings were unfortified. There were no guards, no gates, and no trained warriors. It was the perfect target for men trained to strike fast and disappear just as quickly. Within hours, the raid was over. The ships pushed off from shore, sails rising with the wind, and the island fell silent again. The horror wasn't just in the violence. It was in the meaning. Lindisfarne was sacred ground, one of the holiest sites in England. To see it violated so brutally shook the confidence of the Christian world. This wasn't just a crime. It felt like an attack on God himself. Chroniclers wrote about the event with disbelief and fear. Some said it was a punishment from heaven. Others simply didn't have words for what had happened. But to the Norse raiders, this was just the beginning. They didn't see themselves as villains. They saw opportunity. The West was soft and wealthy, and Lindisfarne had just shown them how easy it could be. The years following Lindisfarne saw the raids spread like fire across the British Isles. Small coastal villages, churches, and monasteries were hit one after the other. The pattern was always the same: sudden arrival, overwhelming force, swift departure. In 794, they attacked Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow, 2 more English monasteries. By 795, they had reached Ireland, plundering the monastery at Iona. Now the threat felt everywhere. In Scotland, Viking ships began to slip into narrow inlets called sea lochs, attacking both coastal settlements and those hidden inland. The Norse were not limited to open seas. They moved easily through rivers and channels. Their targets included both wealthy churches and isolated farming communities. Resistance was minimal. Local defenders were often untrained and poorly armed. The surprise and speed of the attacks left little time to react. By 799, the Frankish Empire, ruled by Charlemagne, also felt the blow. Coastal settlements in what is now France were struck, including the trading hub of Noirmoutier. Charlemagne was furious. He issued orders to fortify ports and protect churches, but even his empire struggled to match the mobility of the Viking longships. By the early 800s, raids reached as far south as Spain and as far north as the Shetland Islands. The Irish monasteries, some of the wealthiest and most isolated in Europe, were frequent targets. Armagh, Clonmacnoise, and Kells were all attacked during this period. The Irish annals record brutal killings, abductions, and the looting of precious manuscripts. Yet, these weren't mindless acts. The Vikings took what could be sold, silver, cattle, people, and left before any organized defense could be mounted. These raids weren't full-scale wars. They were precise, profitable, and terrifying. The Norse had found their advantage. They used it relentlessly, and for much of Western Europe, the coastlines were no longer safe. The Norse targeted monasteries for a reason. They were wealthy, isolated, and unprotected. For centuries, monasteries had received donations of gold, silver, and land from kings and nobles. Their treasuries grew rich with sacred objects, jeweled crosses, silver chalices, golden reliquaries. But their defense systems remained non-existent. Few even had stone walls. To a Viking crew, these religious sites were ideal. Monks were not warriors. They didn't resist. There were no garrisons or trained guards. And most monasteries were built near rivers or coastlines, making them easy to approach by ship. The Norse raiders had no interest in scripture or relics as symbols. They saw them as resources, materials that could be melted down, sold, or used to pay their crews. In many ways, the monasteries reflected the imbalance of the time. The church had grown rich in faith and treasure, but had neglected the practical need for protection. The Vikings exploited this gap. They moved in small, fast units. They knew which places had the most to offer, and they planned accordingly. Many raids happened at dawn or during storms, times when response would be slow or confused. The psychological impact was devastating. People began to associate Viking raids not with military invasions, but with divine punishment. If the holiest places could fall, what hope did ordinary villages have? Monks began hiding valuables or burying manuscripts in the earth before attacks. But more often than not, they couldn't act fast enough. Monasteries had once been centers of learning and peace. Now they were seen as targets. And in this new age, peace was a luxury very few could afford. What made Viking raids so successful wasn't just courage, it was technology. At the center of that advantage was the Longship. These sleek, flexible boats were engineered for speed and silence. Built with overlapping planks, held together by iron nails and pitch, they were strong enough for ocean travel, yet shallow enough to move through rivers. A typical longship could carry 40 to 60 warriors. It had a single square sail and multiple oars on each side. This design gave the crew control over speed and direction, regardless of wind conditions. When needed, they could row silently through narrow waterways or haul the ship across short stretches of land. No other culture had anything like it. The longship's shape allowed it to approach coastlines directly, even at low tide. It needed very little water to stay afloat. That meant Viking crews could land almost anywhere, beaches, riverbanks, even muddy inlets, and once the raid was over, they could vanish just as fast, disappearing into the horizon before anyone could organize a pursuit. Longships weren't just tools of war. They were symbols of freedom and power. Boys grew up around them. Men took pride in crafting and maintaining them. The Norse saw the sea not as a barrier, but as a path to glory. With the right ship and a bold crew, A man could reach across the known world, and many did. These ships allowed for more than surprise. They allowed for escape, survival, and exploration. Without them, the Viking Age would have been impossible. With them, the Norse became the most mobile force in early medieval Europe. Viking raids were short, brutal, and effective. They didn't follow traditional battlefield rules. Instead of forming lines and waiting for battle to be joined, they moved quickly and hit when their enemies were weakest. The goal wasn't conquest, it was profit. A raid was successful if the crew returned home with silver, goods, or slaves. The first step was information. Viking crews gathered knowledge through scouting and trade. They often posed as merchants, learning which towns were wealthy and unguarded. Then they returned later with weapons. They struck early in the morning or under cover of storms, when defenders were least prepared. Surprise was key. By the time a town realized what was happening, the raiders were already inside. Fires were set to cause confusion. Men were cut down quickly. Wealth was taken and prisoners were bound. The attack might last less than an hour. Once finished, the Norse returned to their ships and were gone before reinforcements arrived. Retreat wasn't seen as weakness, it was part of the plan. The Norse knew the land they struck was foreign. They didn't stay to occupy or govern, not yet. They took what they needed and left. If resistance grew, they simply moved to another coast, another river, another monastery. This flexibility made them almost impossible to defeat in the early years. These tactics turned the Vikings into a kind of storm, unpredictable, fast, and destructive. And just like a storm, they didn't stay in one place. They moved from coast to coast, leaving chaos behind. The response from the Christian West was immediate and panicked. Word of the Lindisfarne raid spread through England, across the Channel, into Francia, and into the Vatican itself. Monks and priests wrote of the Vikings as demons sent from hell. They described them with horror. Tall, wild men with axes, cloaked in animal skins, shouting in unknown tongues. This fear became part of the historical record. Letters, chronicles, and sermons all repeated the same message: that the Viking threat was punishment from God. This wasn't just fear, it was propaganda. By framing the raids as divine judgment, church leaders hoped to inspire repentance and greater loyalty to the faith. Kings and nobles reacted by trying to fortify coastlines. Charlemagne ordered defensive towers along rivers. The Anglo-Saxon kings increased military levies. But the response was slow and uneven. Most regions had no standing armies. By the time troops could be assembled, the Vikings were already gone. Art and writing from this period reflected the panic. Illuminated manuscripts began to include scenes of burning churches and ships on stormy seas. Saints' stories were rewritten to emphasize protection from Norse attackers. And for generations, Viking raids were remembered not just as historical events, but as a kind of nightmare that had changed everything. But the fear also hid a truth. The Norse weren't monsters. They were strategic. They chose their targets carefully. They were driven not by hatred, but by opportunity. And in the years to come, they would become more than raiders. They would become rulers, settlers, and kings. Viking control in England, the Dane Law. In 865 CE, the Viking world reached a turning point. That year, a massive Norse force, far larger than anything seen before, landed in East Anglia. They weren't just warriors looking for treasure. They brought families, tools, and leaders with names that would be feared across kingdoms: Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Guthrum. Their plan wasn't to take and leave. It was to take and stay. This force, later known as the Great Heathen Army, moved methodically through the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. They captured Northumbria, forced East Anglia into submission, and broke through into Mercia. Their victories were not random acts of violence. They were organized, calculated, and brutal. These warriors weren't just testing England, they were carving it apart. The land they conquered soon became known as the Dane Law. It wasn't a treaty, it was a reality. In these regions, Norse customs replaced Anglo-Saxon ones. Disputes were handled by things, assemblies of free men. Land was divided differently. Legal terms changed. Names of towns took on Norse endings: Grimsby, Derby, Whitby. The influence ran deep, from street markets to courtroom decisions. Inside the Danelaw, life adjusted. Not everyone resisted. Many Anglo-Saxon families adapted to the new power structure. Over time, marriages formed between Norse settlers and local women. Children grew up in homes where two languages were spoken and two cultures lived under the same roof. This wasn't a smooth transition, but it wasn't total chaos either. It was the beginning of cultural fusion. The Danelaw was not a centralized kingdom. It was a loose patchwork of Viking-controlled areas, each run by its own warlord or chieftain. Some ruled with fear, others with loyalty. What they had in common was a shared code: honor, stability, and control. Raiding gave way to taxing. Looting gave way to law. The sword was still present, but it hung over land that was now theirs. What made the Danelaw so significant wasn't just the size of the territory. It was the mindset shift it represented. The Vikings were no longer outsiders on the coast. They were landlords. And in doing so, they changed not just English history, but their own. When the Norse took York in 866 CE, they didn't destroy it. They rebuilt it. They renamed it Yorvik, and it became the heart of Norse England. It wasn't chosen randomly. York was a vital city, with river access, fertile surroundings, and a strategic location. It had once been Roman, then Anglo-Saxon. Now it was Viking, and the transformation was immediate. Under Norse rule, Yorvik thrived. Markets opened where soldiers once stood. Artisans set up shops crafting leather goods, iron tools, and silver jewelry. Goods flowed in from the Irish Sea and out into the North Sea. Every corner of the city buzzed with movement: dealers, farmers, blacksmiths, and traders, all crowding narrow wooden streets lined with stalls and homes. The city wasn't built on improvisation. The Norse were planners. Archaeological finds at Coppergate in modern-day York show homes arranged in neat rows, with waste pits dug far from living spaces and public wells providing clean water. Items like weaving tools, gaming pieces, and imported glassware suggest a life more sophisticated than legend would suggest. Other towns rose alongside Yorvik. Lincoln, Stamford, Derby, and Leicester grew as regional Norse centers. These weren't random outposts. They were structured communities with marketplaces, governance, and defenses. While the Viking image remained one of axes and fire, in these towns, the real tools were hammers, scales, and silver coins. Religion in these settlements was complicated. Norse pagans lived alongside Anglo-Saxon Christians. Some Vikings converted, sometimes for political gain, sometimes out of conviction. Churches stood beside longhouses. Crosses appeared on Viking tombstones. The gods of the North weren't gone, but they were no longer alone. Yorvik symbolized more than Norse victory. It stood for Norse permanence. The Vikings didn't just seize the city, they owned it. They walked its streets, buried their dead beneath its soil, and taught their children to call it home. It wasn't just a conquest, it was a transformation. The Viking presence in Ireland was equally bold but unfolded differently. In 841 CE, the Norse established a long fort at a key point along the River Liffey. That base would soon grow into Dublin. At first, it was a seasonal base for launching attacks, but over time it became a fixed settlement, a port city that would connect Ireland to a wider Viking world. Dublin became the Norse capital in Ireland. It had a sheltered harbor, access to inland trade, and deep ties to seaborne routes across the Irish Sea. The Norse quickly fortified the town, built docks, and established markets. Silver flowed in from abroad, while goods like hides, grain, and iron flowed out. The city became wealthy, not just from raiding, but from managing a growing regional economy. But the Vikings didn't stop with Dublin. They established other key towns, including Waterford, Cork, and Limerick. Each settlement was strategically placed. These towns weren't built to impress. They were built to function. Norse ships could dock easily. Supplies could be stored. And when battles came, these ports could defend themselves. Conflict with Irish kings was constant. The Norse fought hard and often lost territory, but they always returned. Sometimes they allied with local Irish lords. Sometimes they were the enemy of all. But even when their political control wavered, their settlements endured. Trade continued. Families remained. Towns held strong. These settlements introduced urban life to many parts of Ireland. Before the Norse, Irish society was mostly rural and clan-based. The Viking towns brought markets, shipyards, taxes, and public authority. They weren't perfect, but they were organized and lasting. By the close of the 9th century, Norse Dublin wasn't just an outpost, it was a powerhouse. And while Irish resistance remained strong, the Norse had embedded themselves into the fabric of Irish coastal life. Their towns would outlast their political dominance. As Norse towns stabilized, trade exploded. The Vikings weren't just warriors, they were world-class traders. From Dublin to Novgorod, from Hedeby to Constantinople, they built a commercial network that stretched farther than any single kingdom in Europe. And they made their settlements into gateways for everything from amber to silver. One of the clearest signs of this trade comes from the ground itself. Thousands of silver hoards, buried caches of coins and jewelry, have been found across Viking territory. Many include Arabic dirhams, silver coins minted in the Islamic world. These coins didn't come from raiding, they were payment for fur, ivory, and slaves. Goods the Norse moved across vast inland routes like the Dnieper and Volga rivers. In the west, towns like Yorvik and Dublin became commercial centers. Goods passed through their ports from France, Germany, and the Baltic. Vikings didn't just sell, they bought. Glass beads from the east, silk from Byzantium, wine from Gaul, all flowed through their markets. Silver became the standard of wealth, not land. The human side of this economy was darker. Slavery played a significant role in Viking trade. Raids provided captives, but some were bought from other cultures. These slaves were sold across Europe and the Middle East. While difficult to confront, this trade was a real and profitable part of the Norse world, and it helped fund their cities and ships. Craftsmanship also surged. Norse artisans improved their techniques through exposure to foreign goods. Jewelry, tools, and even weapons began to reflect hybrid styles. A brooch made in Dublin might bear Irish patterns, Norse materials, and a Frankish clasp. This wasn't imitation, it was evolution. By 900 CE, Viking trade routes connected more cultures than most empires. Their ships carried not just warriors, but wealth, and their towns weren't just ports. They were international hubs, driven by silver, shaped by movement, and made strong by the flow of goods. At the start of the Viking Age, the Norse identity was tied to the sea. A man's worth was judged by what he brought back from raids. But by the end of the 9th century, that identity had shifted. More Vikings stayed than sailed. They built towns, governed people, and defended land they called their own. Raiding had served its purpose. It made them rich, but wealth needed walls. It needed rules, and it needed someone to enforce them. The same men who once led ship crews became warlords of cities. They collected taxes, resolved disputes, led armies in defense. Not just in conquest. New generations were born into this world. Sons of warriors grew up learning to farm, trade, and negotiate. They still honored courage, but they also valued control. For them, the Viking Age wasn't a memory, it was the present, shaped by both axe and plow. Laws evolved. The Thing assemblies became places not just of judgment, but of policy. Land ownership mattered. Inheritance had rules. Justice was no longer just about revenge, it was about order. What emerged wasn't an empire, but a network of Norse-led polities that felt more stable than anything they'd had before. Religion changed with this identity shift. Pagan leaders saw the power of aligning with Christianity. Conversions became common, partly for survival, partly for diplomacy. Churches were built beside old temples. New customs formed. The Norse weren't abandoning their roots, they were adapting to rule. By 900 CE, the Vikings were no longer just visitors or invaders. They were settlers with homes, rulers with laws, and fathers with legacies. Their transformation was complete. And what came next would shape the kingdoms of Europe for centuries. Harald Fairhair unifies Norway. After decades of raiding and settling, some Vikings wanted more than land, they wanted kingdoms. In the lands they had once burned, they now began to rule. From Norway to Denmark to the shores of Normandy, Viking chieftains transformed into monarchs. Their axes did not disappear, but now they came with crowns. Norway had long been divided. Clans, chieftains, and small coastal kingdoms fought over valleys and fjords. There was no central rule, just scattered loyalty to local warlords. That changed when one man, Harald Fairhair, swore not to cut his hair until he became king of all Norway. It was a bold promise from a young warrior, but Harald would keep that vow and change Norway forever. Harald rose to power after defeating a powerful rival at the Battle of Hafrsfjord around 872 CE. With that victory, he began absorbing smaller territories under his rule. Some leaders submitted, others resisted and were crushed. For the first time, Norway began to feel like one land under one ruler. Harald took control of trade routes, forced loyalty from nobles, and began a new era of unity. It was not peace, but it was order. Many free farmers disliked this new authority. Some left for Iceland and the British Isles seeking freedom over royal rule, but others stayed and adapted. Harald's rule brought stability to key ports and allowed larger fleets to form under one banner. Instead of countless small raids, Norway could now launch coordinated campaigns. The age of Viking kingdoms had begun, and Harald was its first architect. Harald also married strategically, building alliances across rival clans. His wives produced many sons, which later led to internal disputes. Still, his grip on power held. In his final years, he passed parts of his kingdom to his sons, planting seeds of future division. But the legacy he left was clear. He had taken a land of scattered warlords and forged it into a single kingdom. Norwegian identity was changing. Once just seafarers and raiders, the Norse now had a homeland bound by one king's vision. Harald's story lived on not just in saga, but in the very borders of the land he shaped. While others still raided abroad, Norway itself was no longer just a base. It was a kingdom worth defending. When Harald died around 930 CE, Norway would not stay united for long. Yet the idea had been born. The Norse could rule, not just Rome, and though his sons would clash, Norway would never again return fully to the chaos that existed before him. While Norway took its first steps toward unity, Denmark was entering its golden rise. In Jutland, a war chief named Gorm the Old emerged around 936 CE. He was not just another raider. He became the first historically confirmed king of Denmark. Unlike previous rulers whose stories faded into legend, Gorm left behind stone and steel, literal monuments to his power. Gorm ruled from Jelling, a central point that grew into a royal stronghold. His reign marked the beginning of an official Danish monarchy. He expanded territory, tightened laws, and strengthened control over local nobles. Gorm's leadership was firm, and his vision was grounded in permanence. Denmark wasn't just raiding, it was building. His son, Harald Bluetooth, took that foundation and made it global. Harald is remembered for uniting all of Denmark and much of Norway under his crown. But more than that, he began to transition Denmark into the Christian world. Around 965 CE, Harald converted to Christianity. possibly under pressure from the Holy Roman Empire. This was not just spiritual, it was political. He saw the benefit of aligning with Europe's rising powers. Harold Bluetooth also left behind the famous gelling stones, enormous runic monuments that declared his rule and his role in Christianizing the Danes. These stones still stand today, carved with crosses and Norse figures. They show how a pagan warrior society began reshaping itself to survive in a changing world. Harold's Denmark was now both Viking and Christian, a kingdom with one foot in the past and one in the future. Bluetooth also modernized Danish infrastructure. He built bridges, fortresses, and circular forts called Trelleborgs, which supported royal troops and centralized rule. His coinage spread across the region, stamping royal authority into daily life. Denmark was no longer just feared. It was organized. This wasn't just about Harold. It was about the shape of Viking power. Through rulers like Gorm and Bluetooth, Danish authority stretched beyond raiding coasts. It began influencing trade, politics, and religion. A true northern kingdom had risen, and it was here to stay. As Viking warlords became kings, the tools of power began to change. It was no longer just swords and ships. Now they used coins, councils, and dynasties to hold control. This marked a shift from battlefield strength to structured rule, the birth of medieval Scandinavian governance. Coinage became a key symbol. Kings like Harold Bluetooth began issuing coins bearing their names and Christian symbols. These weren't just currency, they were propaganda. Every coin reminded traders and citizens who ruled, and under what faith. It was a quiet but constant display of power. Dynasties also mattered more than ever. Rulers began planning succession, marrying for political alliances, and naming heirs in advance. Bloodlines were used to claim lands, not just swords. This change brought a new kind of Viking conflict, not just over land, but over legitimacy. Who was the rightful king? Which family had divine or ancestral right? Councils and courts began to appear in royal centers. Kings appointed jarls to enforce laws, collect taxes, and defend borders. These local lords owed loyalty to the crown, but also kept their own power. It was a balance, one that worked only when the king was strong enough to hold their respect. When that failed, civil wars erupted, written records increased. Though still limited, some laws and royal orders were recorded by monks or scribes. This marked the slow end of oral rule and the rise of documented authority. Governance was becoming more predictable, and that gave kings more lasting control. For Viking societies, this was new ground. They had always valued personal freedom, clan loyalty, and warrior strength. Now they had to learn bureaucracy, taxation, and royal chains of command. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way to survive the next phase of European history. While some Vikings turned to kingship in the north, others carved out power in foreign lands. Nowhere was this more dramatic than in northern France. In 911 CE, a Viking leader named Rollo was granted land by the Frankish king, Charles the Simple. That land became Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo had led brutal raids along the Seine, but instead of continuing endless attacks, Charles made a deal. In exchange for peace, Rollo and his men would convert to Christianity, defend the region, and swear loyalty to the Frankish crown. Rollo agreed. It was the beginning of a powerful new chapter, Vikings becoming French lords. The land Rollo received was not empty. It was populated, organized, and tied to European feudal customs. But Rollo's Norse followers adapted. They married local women, adopted the language, and over time became Normans. Yet their roots remained. They kept their boldness, their tactics, and their hunger for conquest. Rollo ruled well. His descendants expanded Normandy, built castles, and created a powerful duchy. By the time of his great-great-grandson, William the Conqueror, Normandy would rival entire kingdoms. In 1066, a Norman army descended from Vikings, would invade England and change its history forever. Normandy was proof that Vikings didn't just vanish. They evolved, they settled, adapted, and then reshaped the very lands they had once terrorized. Rollo's choice to take land instead of gold set the stage for one of Europe's most influential dynasties. The Normans built cathedrals and armies, they formed laws and minted coins. But beneath it all, their Viking roots never fully disappeared. Rollo's legacy lived on in their ambition, their warfare, and their pride. Normandy was Viking power reborn in a new form, more polished but just as fierce. With kingdoms now rising in Norway, Denmark, and abroad, Viking unity fractured. Power always creates tension. As dynasties grew, so did rivalries. Sons fought over thrones, nobles rebelled, alliances were made and broken as fast as the tides. In Norway, Harald Fairhair's many sons split his kingdom after his death. This caused repeated civil wars. Kings were declared and overthrown in quick succession. Some nobles sided with local leaders, others fled or sought help from Denmark. These struggles slowed Norway's growth and weakened central rule. Denmark faced its own challenges. After Harald Bluetooth, his son, Sweyn Forkbeard, rebelled against him. Father and son fought for years. The crown passed through conflict, not peace. These royal disputes opened the door for foreign influence and religious tension. In the wider Norse world, leaders constantly shifted loyalties. One year they would support the king. The next, they'd raise an army against him. Pagan beliefs clashed with Christian reforms. The old warrior values resisted royal taxes and church rules. The Viking world stood at a crossroads. Tradition or transformation. Despite the chaos, these conflicts forced kings to evolve. They learned to negotiate, to bribe, to marry wisely, and to use religion as leverage. Royal courts became more strategic. Every decision could mean survival or downfall. The Viking world was no longer just a storm from the north. It was now a collection of rising powers, each vying for control. The age of scattered raids was ending. A new chapter had begun, one of crowns, betrayals, and royal ambition. Eric, the Red, and the Greenland colonies. The Viking hunger for land did not stop at England. As pressure grew at home, they turned their sails to the unknown, from the frozen west of Greenland to the golden gates of Constantinople. They chased land, gold, honor, and survival across waters few dared to cross. And in doing so, they became something more than raiders or kings. They became explorers, ones who reached farther than anyone in their time. Eric the Red was not born into peace. He was born into exile. His father had been banished from Norway for murder, and Eric carried that legacy with him. After a violent conflict in Iceland, Eric too was exiled. But instead of fading away, he sailed west, far beyond known waters, and found something unexpected: a cold, harsh, empty land. He named it Greenland, hoping the name would attract settlers. It worked. In 985 CE, Eric returned to Iceland and began recruiting others. He promised them opportunity, land, freedom, and fresh beginnings. Many were desperate. Climate pressure and political tension in Iceland had left families struggling, so they followed Eric across treacherous waters. When they landed on Greenland's coast, it was no paradise, but it was land, and it was theirs. The Greenland colonies were not easy to build. The landscape was rugged, the winters brutal, but the Norse were tough. They brought livestock, built long houses, and grew hay during short summers. Over time, two major settlements formed, the eastern and western settlements, each with farms, churches, and even local law gatherings. These weren't just camps, they were full communities. Trade with Europe helped Greenland survive. Ivory from walrus tusks became a valuable export, but the colonies were always fragile. Food shortages, disease, and isolation were constant threats. Yet for a generation, these Norse settlers held on. They raised children, buried their dead, and carved out a life at the edge of the world. Eric himself lived in Brattahlid, a small estate near the fjords. He never returned to Norway. For him, Greenland was more than exile, it was legacy, and for a time it worked. His son Leif would carry that legacy even farther west. The Red family had gone from outlaws to pioneers of the edge. Greenland became the final Norse frontier in the west. But even as the cold crept in and settlers struggled, something deeper was happening. These were not the Vikings of Lindisfarne anymore. These were families building lives far beyond anything the sagas had imagined. Leif Erikson was born into a world of risk and ocean winds. The son of Eric the Red, he grew up hearing tales of distant lands and dangerous voyages, but Leif would go even farther than his father. Around the year 1000, he sailed west of Greenland and landed on a forested shore. This was not ice. This was something new, warmer, rich in grapes and timber. He called it Vinland. According to the Icelandic sagas, Leif's journey was partly accidental. He had heard of land spotted by another Norseman, Bjarni Herjolfsson. Leif decided to find it himself. He took a crew, set sail from Greenland, and reached what we now believe was the coast of Newfoundland in modern-day Canada. It was the first known European contact with North America, 500 years before Columbus. Archaeological evidence backs the story. At Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, ruins of Norse-style buildings have been uncovered. Longhouses, workshops, and iron tools. These are not native structures. They match Viking design and technique. They show that Norse explorers did not just see North America. They camped there, worked there, and tried to stay. The land offered much. Timber, which was scarce in Greenland, was abundant here. Fish filled the rivers. Wild grapes grew in the south. The Norse gathered resources and sent them home. Some sagas describe peaceful trade with native people. Others hint at conflict. What's clear is this: they were not alone, and they were not welcome for long. Leif didn't build a lasting colony, but his voyage proved something vital, that Norse seafaring had no limits. They had crossed from Europe to Greenland and now to the Americas. Not for glory, not even for conquest, but for survival and the chance to build something new. Vinland was not just a place, it was a turning point. It showed the courage and vision of a people once known only for raiding. It redefined the Viking legacy, not just as warriors, but as the first Europeans to reach a new world. Vinland was a place of promise, but it didn't last. Despite its natural resources and its strategic location, the Norse never built a permanent settlement in North America. The question is, why? The answer lies in tension, distance, and survival. Vinland was not empty, and the Norse were not prepared for what they faced. First, the native peoples of North America were not passive. They had their own networks, tribes, and defenses. Norse sagas refer to them as skraelings, a term that likely referred to the local indigenous groups. At first, there may have been trade, but tensions grew. Clashes broke out. The Norse, used to open battle, were now facing an unfamiliar kind of resistance, one rooted in ambushes and mobility. Second, the distance was too great. Vinland was over 2,000 miles from Norway. Supplies could not arrive regularly. Even from Greenland, the voyage was long and dangerous. Every trip risked lives and ships, without a steady link to the homeland. No outpost could grow into a city. Isolation killed momentum. Third, Greenland itself was struggling. With limited food and a harsh climate, the Greenlandic Norse could barely support themselves. They had no capacity to send reinforcements west. Whatever ambitions they had for Vinland were slowly buried under ice and hardship. Fourth, internal politics pulled attention away. Back in Scandinavia, royal rivalries, Christian reforms, and shifting power demanded focus. Kings and jarls were not concerned with a far-off land they had never seen. The political will to back Vinland simply didn't exist. Finally, the Norse may not have wanted to fight for it. They were practical people. If the land was too costly to hold, They moved on. Unlike later European empires, the Vikings lacked the population, military backing, and economic systems to force a permanent colony into existence. They explored. They left a mark. Then they let go. Vinland faded from Norse memory, but it did not disappear from history. Its ruins, its sagas, and its story remain. Proof that the Vikings reached the New World long before anyone else. It was a bold chapter. Even in failure, it remains one of the most remarkable journeys of the medieval world. While some Vikings sailed west, others turned east, into the rivers of modern-day Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. These Norsemen were known as Varangians. They didn't just raid. They built trade routes, forged alliances, and shaped a region that would one day become a powerful empire. Their legacy in the east is as deep as their story in the west. The Varangians followed the great river systems, the Dvina, the Dnieper, and the Volga, using their shallow draft longships to travel deep into the Slavic lands. They reached key trading centers like Novgorod and Kiev. These weren't just stops. They became bases of power. Viking leaders settled there, married local women, and became rulers in their own right. One figure stands out, Rurik. Around 862, Rurik established control over Novgorod and began a dynasty that would last for centuries. His descendants ruled over what would become Kievan Rus, the foundation of modern Russia. These Norse leaders didn't impose their culture. Instead, they blended it. They adopted Slavic languages and customs while keeping their Norse strength. Trade was at the heart of this expansion. The Varangians moved goods between the Baltic and the Black Sea. They traded furs, wax, honey, and slaves for silver, silk, and spices. Their roots connected the Islamic world, Byzantium, and Northern Europe. In doing so, they created one of the most important economic arteries of the medieval world. But the East wasn't peaceful. The Varangians often fought local tribes, rival Slavic leaders, and nomadic raiders. Their power came from both trade and war. They built wooden forts, defended river crossings, and sometimes ruled by force. Yet they also brought structure, uniting fragmented regions under larger leadership. The Viking presence in Kievan Rus was not brief. It lasted for generations. By the 10th century, these Norse settlers had become part of the land. Their blood ran in the veins of future rulers, their ships changed the rivers, and their story helped shape an empire that would endure long after the Viking Age had ended. The furthest a Viking could go was not west, but south. In the heart of the Byzantine Empire, inside the great city of Constantinople, Norse warriors served as elite guards. They were known as the Varangian Guard. For nearly 300 years, these northern giants stood at the gates of emperors, not as invaders, but as protectors. The Varangians were hired by the Byzantine Emperor Basil II around 988 CE. He needed soldiers who were loyal, disciplined, and fierce. The Norse fit that perfectly. Unlike local troops, the Varangians had no ties to internal factions. They were loyal only to the emperor. They became his bodyguards, his enforcers, and sometimes his executioners. Their reputation grew fast. Clad in heavy armor, wielding massive axes, they towered over most Mediterranean men. In battle, they were unstoppable. In court, they were feared. Yet they remained disciplined. They did not take bribes. They followed orders. They were outsiders, but they became essential. Serving in the Varangian Guard was an honor. Norsemen from Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland traveled south to join. Many returned home wealthy, carrying gold, silk, and stories of the great city by the sea. Some never returned. They were buried in foreign soil, in the service of emperors who spoke another tongue. The Guard also left cultural footprints. Norse runes have been found carved into the marble of Byzantine buildings. Messages from homesick warriors far from their fjords. They didn't conquer Constantinople, but they left their mark, in stone, in blood, and in history. In the end, the Varangian Guard proved something crucial. The Viking world was not just about land or loot. It was about honor, skill, and the search for purpose. These warriors, once feared as raiders, became trusted guardians of one of the most powerful empires on earth, from foreign crosses to native kings. By the year 1000, Viking sails had touched almost every shore in the known world, in foreign courts. And from Ireland to Byzantium, they saw crosses where once they saw swords. They fought for Christian kings, traded in Christian markets, and buried silver marked with crosses. Faith followed them home. But what began as quiet influence would soon become a storm. In Norway, two men would lead it. Their names were Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, known to history as Saint Olaf. Olaf Tryggvason had been baptized abroad, raised in Slavic courts and trained in warfare. He returned to Norway not just to rule, but to convert. He did not ask, he demanded. Those who resisted faced exile, torture, or death. Pagan temples were burned, idols were smashed, villages were forced to kneel, not just before kings, but before Christ. The shift was fast and brutal. Olaf believed the Norse gods had no place in the world he saw rising around him. But Olaf Tryggvason's reign was short. He died at sea in 1000 CE during the Battle of Svolder. His defeat didn't end the Christian cause. It passed into the hands of his younger namesake, Olaf II. This Olaf knew that swords could start conversions, but only law and leadership could finish them. He outlawed pagan sacrifices. He built churches. He rewrote the legal code of Norway to reflect Christian values. He wasn't just changing religion, he was changing the country. Still, not everyone followed. Pagan chiefs saw these new rules as an attack on their way of life. The things their ancestors had done for centuries, like marking the solstice or sacrificing at the sacred groves, were now crimes. The land that had once been ruled by honor and clan loyalty was now watched by bishops and foreign priests. This wasn't just about faith, it was about identity, and it split the country. When Olaf II was killed in battle in 1030, it looked like the old gods had returned. But his death sparked something unexpected. Stories began to spread of miracles at his grave. Sick people were healed, visions were seen. His followers declared him a saint. Within a few years, the church made it official. Olaf, the warlord king, was now Saint Olaf. In death, he became the symbol of a Christian Norway. The cross was no longer foreign. It was now born from Norse blood. From that point on, Christianity wasn't just a royal order, it was part of life. Kings who followed Olaf continued his mission. Churches replaced wooden shrines, laws were rewritten, bishops were appointed. The Viking world had entered a new age, not with a raid, but with a prayer. But this transformation did not come peacefully. Across Scandinavia, many resisted the change. They didn't see the cross as salvation, they saw it as submission. Villages refused to tear down their temples. Some chiefs held on to the old gods in secret, others gathered warriors and fought back openly. The Christian kings called it rebellion. The pagans called it defense. In some parts of Sweden, resistance lasted longer. Local rulers like Blotswine kept the old rites alive. They led public sacrifices. They mocked Christian missionaries. When priests came with books and crosses, some were beaten, even killed. The struggle was not just on battlefields. It was in homes and councils and families. Parents who grew up honoring Thor now watched their children baptized in churches they didn't believe in. These were not minor debates. Lives were torn apart. In Iceland, the choice between faiths nearly led to civil war. But in the year 1000, Iceland's leaders made a decision. The country would convert to Christianity, not because of belief, but to avoid bloodshed. Yet even then, they allowed private worship of the old gods for a time. It was a compromise, one that showed how deep the divide had become. The violence didn't always come from kings. Sometimes it came from neighbors. Old rivalries took new forms. Christians accused pagans of devil worship. Pagans mocked the meekness of Christ. Fights broke out in local things. Temples were defaced in the night. Grave markers were stolen. The Viking world was turning on itself, not for land or gold, but for the right to believe. For many, this wasn't just about gods. It was about losing a connection to the past. The old rituals were tied to the land, the seasons, and the ancestors. Christianity brought new rhythms: Sundays, saints' days, fasting. These were foreign ideas forced into familiar lives. For some, it felt like forgetting who they were. And that loss lingered for generations. Still, as the years passed, resistance faded. Converts became parents. Parents raised Christian children. Churches became centers of community. And slowly, what had once been forced began to feel normal. But underneath it all, the memory of the old gods remained, not in power, but in legend. Christianity didn't just change beliefs, it reshaped Norse culture. Before, there were no written laws, only spoken ones. Now, scribes wrote down royal decrees. Latin, not Old Norse, became the language of learning. Runes gave way to Roman letters. Oral poems gave way to gospel texts. The Viking world was learning to write, and what they wrote was no longer just sagas. It was scripture, law, and liturgy. Kings began to rule with the support of bishops. Laws were made to reflect biblical ideas. Blood feuds, once common, were now condemned. Warguild was restructured under Christian justice. Punishments were less about family honor and more about divine will. The shift was not just in action, but in meaning. Every part of life now passed through a Christian lens. Festivals changed too. Yule, once a feast to the gods of fertility, became Christmas. Spring rites turned into Easter. Christian saints replaced Norse ancestors as figures of veneration. Where once the people danced around bonfires, they now gathered in stone churches. The symbols changed, but the need for ritual remained. The shift wasn't only about law and ritual, it changed how people thought. The world was no longer ruled by many gods with shifting moods. Now there was one God, all-seeing and eternal. Fate gave way to divine judgment. Battles were no longer won just by skill, but by the will of heaven. This shaped how Vikings saw death, honor, and even war. The Christian Church also brought new networks of power. Priests were trained abroad. Ideas flowed in from England, Germany, and Rome. Scandinavia was no longer an outsider to Europe. It was part of its spiritual map. With every new bishop, every rebuilt church, the Viking North became more connected to the Christian West. But the transformation was never perfect. Folk beliefs survived in rural corners. Runes still appeared on gravestones. And in the deep woods or dark winters, stories of Thor, Freya, and Odin still lingered, not as gods, but as echoes. The first churches were simple, made of wood, built by hand. But as the faith deepened, so did the ambition. Stone churches began to appear. Carvings of crosses replaced dragon heads. Bell towers rose above the forests. In cities like Trondheim, churches became symbols of royal power. They stood not just as places of worship, but as signs of a new order. These churches were more than buildings. They became centers of life. Inside, priests preached in Latin. Outside, markets and gatherings grew. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, the rhythms of life moved to the sound of church bells. The old gods had no such buildings. The cross had claimed the land in stone. With churches came schools. Boys learned to read. Some would become priests. Literacy, once unknown, began to spread. Slowly but surely, Latin texts arrived from abroad. The Bible entered Viking lands, not through war, but through pages. This changed how history was remembered. Oral sagas were now joined by written chronicles. Art changed, too. Viking carvings once showed warriors and ships. Now they showed saints and halos. The dragon became a symbol of sin. The sword of the warrior turned into the cross of the martyr. Even burial practices shifted. Instead of boat graves or cremation, Christians were buried in rows facing east, waiting for resurrection. But even in these sacred spaces, traces of the old world remained. Some churches were built on former pagan sites. Some carvings still hinted at old patterns. It was not a clean break, but a blending. The Viking people didn't erase their past. They built a new future on top of it. The church grew in power. It advised kings. It settled disputes. It collected tithes. In many ways, it became the new clan, not of blood, but of belief. And by 1060, it was clear. The Viking Age was ending not by conquest, but by conversion. Christianization also transformed the role of women. In pagan times, Norse women had legal rights, property, and influence. Some were priestesses, some led farms. But Christianity brought new rules. The church promoted male authority in the home. Women were encouraged to be obedient, silent, and chaste. The change was slow, but it reshaped family life. Marriage became a Christian sacrament. Divorce was no longer simple. Polygamy was outlawed. Daughters were baptized and raised in Christian homes. Virginity became a virtue. The image of the strong Norse woman was replaced with that of the obedient Christian wife. Not everyone accepted this, but over time, the expectations shifted. Funerals changed too. In the old ways, women prepared the dead, performed songs, and lit funeral pyres. Now, priests took over. Burial became a church matter. The rituals became uniform. The role of women in these transitions grew smaller. What had once been community-led became clergy-led. Christianity also created new paths for women. In convents, some noble women became nuns. They learned to read, to pray, and to serve. While limited, these roles gave women influence in new ways. Still, it was a far cry from the freedom some had once known in pagan society. The legal system shifted toward written codes. The church influenced everything from inheritance to trial practices. Blasphemy became a crime. Public confession became common. Morality was now tied to salvation, not just reputation. This affected everyone, but especially women, whose choices were more heavily judged. In the end, Christianization redefined what it meant to be Norse. The gods fell, the cross rose, and with it came a new world, not conquered by swords but by belief. The life of Harald Hardrada, last great Viking warrior. By the mid-11th century, the Viking world had changed. Christianity ruled. Kings now wrote laws, not sagas. But not everyone was ready to let go. One man still lived and fought like the old warriors did, Harald Hardrada. Born in 1015, he wasn't raised to be ordinary. As a teenager, he went to war. His half-brother was Olaf II, the same Saint Olaf who died fighting for Norway's soul. When Olaf fell, Harald fled, but he didn't disappear. He trained, he grew stronger, and he returned. Harald's journey shaped him into something greater than a local king. He fought in the East, not just in Sweden, but in the heart of the Byzantine Empire. There he joined the Varangian Guard, an elite force made up of Norse warriors. He served in Sicily, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. He learned to lead thousands. He learned to command respect. He came back to Norway not just with money, but with vision. A warrior who had seen empires wanted to make one of his own. By 1046, Harald took the throne of Norway, and he ruled it like a battlefield. He crushed local revolts, he raised taxes, he claimed lands in Denmark. His methods were brutal, his rule was absolute, but people followed him. In a time of change, Harald felt like the last echo of a past that still made sense to them. A king who earned his crown with a sword. He wasn't just a ruler, he was a reminder. But as Harald grew older, the Viking world around him kept moving forward. The Norse no longer launched wide-scale raids. The lands they once threatened, like England, were now fortified, Christian, and ruled by kings born from Viking blood. Still, Harold believed he had one more conquest ahead, a final crown to claim. He set his eyes on England. In 1066, Harold Hardrada made his move. He gathered his forces, formed alliances, and set sail. To the outside world, he was an old king chasing an old dream. But to his warriors, he was a legend alive, a man carrying the entire Viking legacy on his shoulders. And they followed. In September 1066, Harold's ships reached the coast of England. He wasn't alone. He was joined by Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of England's King Harold. Together they marched through Yorkshire, capturing towns and demanding loyalty. Their army moved quickly, confident. They thought the English king was too busy defending the south from another threat, William of Normandy. At first, the plan worked. Harold defeated local resistance and prepared for battle near the village of Stamford Bridge. His warriors camped with little fear. They believed the main fight was still days away. But the English king moved faster than expected. On the morning of September 25th, Harold Godwinson's army arrived. The Vikings were caught by surprise. The battle was fierce. Some Norse warriors had left their armor behind, thinking they had time to rest. Still, they fought. Harold, now over 50, stood tall in the middle of the fight. He led from the front, his axe flashing in the sun. For hours, the field was chaos. Sword against shield, brother against brother. Then, in a single moment, everything changed. Harold Hardrada was struck in the throat by an arrow. He fell instantly. His army saw it, their last true Viking king gone. The battle continued for a while longer, but the spirit had broken. By the end of the day, the Norse were defeated. Few made it back to their ships. Fewer still returned to Norway. Stamford Bridge was not just a battle. It was the end of an era. The English king, Harold Godwinson, had won, but his victory was brief. Just 3 weeks later, he would fall to another invader, William the Conqueror. But in that narrow valley near the river Derwent, Viking ambition died with Harold. Harold's death closed the door on something larger than a campaign. It ended the age of Viking expansion. For over 250 years, Norsemen had shaped Europe, from burning monasteries in England to ruling courts in Russia. But after Stamford Bridge, no Viking leader would again attempt to seize a foreign throne. The time of wide-sailing warriors had passed. Back in Norway, the news of Harold's fall was met with sorrow, but also with clarity. His son Magnus took the throne, but he didn't follow the old path. He made peace with Denmark. He focused on building stability, not legacy. Other Scandinavian rulers began doing the same. Kings were no longer seen as war gods. They were lawmakers, administrators, and Christians. Meanwhile, across the sea, another storm brewed. William of Normandy, himself descended from Vikings, crossed the English Channel and defeated Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. England, once the target of Viking raids, was now ruled by a king who bore their blood, but not their name. The irony was deep. Harold Hardrada had died trying to conquer a land already destined to be ruled by his kind. In the years that followed, Norse leaders began blending fully into European courts. They married Christian nobles. They used Latin in their laws. They adopted chivalry, bureaucracy, and taxation. The longboats were docked. The sword gave way to the scepter. But the memory of the raids and the fear they inspired still lingered. The fall of Harold marked not just a military defeat, but a cultural one. The world he came from, a world of gods, honor, and war, was now history, and even those who admired him knew the age had passed. Harold's last breath was the Viking world's final roar. With the end of outward conquest, the Viking homeland began to change from within. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden moved from loose clans and chieftains into centralized monarchies. Instead of being feared for their fleets, they became known for their courts, churches, and currencies. They weren't invaders anymore. They were part of Europe. Kings like Magnus of Norway and Sweyn of Denmark focused on diplomacy. They signed treaties aligned with the church and fostered trade. Cities like Bergen, Roskilde, and Uppsala grew in wealth and size. Trade routes once secured by sword were now protected by law. The same people who once lived by the axe now minted coins. The church grew stronger too. Bishops advised kings. Churches were built with stone, not wood. Monasteries trained scribes. Literacy spread. The values of the Viking world, glory in battle, personal revenge, loyalty to clan, slowly gave way to Christian morality, legal codes, and the rise of bureaucracy. This didn't mean the people forgot. They still told stories of Odin and Thor, of Ragnar and Bjorn. But those were stories now, not rules for life. The sagas moved from memory to manuscript. The Viking identity faded not because it was erased, but because it was absorbed. It lived on, but differently. The shift was not without pain. Some resisted, some held on to old customs in the countryside, but the direction was clear. The Viking world was becoming medieval Scandinavia. It would now be known for its kings, not its raiders, and yet, even as the longships disappeared from the horizon, the Norse legacy refused to vanish. Though the Viking Age ended, the impact of the Norsemen echoed across Europe. Nowhere was this more visible than in the Normans. Rollo, the Viking who settled in northern France, had founded a dynasty that embraced Christianity and French culture, but never forgot its roots. His descendant, William the Conqueror, would change English history forever in 1066. The Norman kings who ruled England brought with them a legacy of Norse ambition, discipline, and military structure. Their castles dotted the land, their laws shaped governance. Even though they spoke French and prayed in Latin, they carried a warrior spirit that was centuries in the making. In Eastern Europe, the Varangian legacy continued through the Kievan Rus. Founded by Swedish Vikings, this federation of states grew into a major power. Its leaders, including Prince Vladimir, embraced Christianity. Over time, this kingdom would evolve into modern Russia, a nation whose name still reflects its Norse beginnings, Rus, from the Norse word for rowers. The Viking influence also shaped Scotland, Ireland, and Iceland. In these places, Norse words entered the local languages. Norse customs became local traditions, and Norse blood mixed into native lineages. Even in distant parts of the world, Viking ancestry lived on in faces, names, and stories. But it wasn't just about bloodlines, it was about ideas. The Vikings had shown Europe what it meant to move, to trade, to challenge borders. Their bravery became legend, their stories became literature, and their way of life, for all its violence, left behind lessons in resilience, exploration, and change. By the 12th century, there were no more Viking raids, no more Norse conquests. But the age had not been forgotten. In every sword forged, every law written, and every ship that sailed west, their spirit endured.